everybody surely should have the same rules applied to them in equal measure. Surely that would be democratic, wouldn't it? Let's talk to Nick Freeman, who's an author, a commentator, a criminal defence lawyer, of course, as well. Nick, a very good morning to you.
Morning, Mike.
Now, maybe, as I said earlier in the day, our attempt at getting a petition through Parliament so that they would at least discuss the possibility of registration for cyclists and insurance and possibly a licence plate, maybe it got to the right people after all, because it seems as though they're now thinking along the same lines as us.
Without question, I have sort of liaised with two previous ministers of transport who have completely ignored it, and you and I started a petition which didn't have widespread support, but clearly we now have a government who, or certainly with Grant Schapps. I'm sorry.
That's all right.
I'm sorry about that.
Don't worry, we'll get that fixed.
Have you got me back?
We'll get you back. I think we have, yes.
Yeah. We've got a minister who's prepared to listen, and it's common sense. You can't have a growing body of cyclists who have no speed limit, no drink drive limit, no drug drive limit, and in essence, no accountability. So you could have a perverse situation where we have all these 20-mile-an-hour speed limits unfolded on our roads. Motorists slow down and cyclists exceed them and then never brought to account. And, we're now, this last year, worst statistics ever for cyclists colliding with pedestrians, hundreds of serious injuries, one or two fatalities. So what we need to do is remove the friction that seems to exist between motorists and cyclists. There should be no friction. We should all say, look, we've got limited road space, we have limited funds, the infrastructure is poor for everybody, and we need to adopt a sensible approach that is collaborative, that works for everyone. And when you say to a group, you are not going to be responsible for your actions, that whole concept of collaboration breaks down, and there is probably a minority, but a significant minority, who are causing a serious threat to pedestrians and to other road users, and of course to themselves.
Yes.
So, what we have discussed and what we've called for and petitioned for is, in essence, just complete parity for all road users. And I have to say, Mike, I would also target pedestrians, and whilst I'm not suggesting for one moment they should wear a number plate or a registered tabard, I do suggest that there should be a consideration for legislation to enforce them in city centres to cross the road in designated areas and not to be allowed to cross the road listening to music, being on their phones or having headphones in their ears, because they need to assume responsibility for their safety as well. So everybody is involved who uses this limited.
And again, when people who are critical of these possible changes, you just have to point to any number of cities in America where they have jaywalking rules, which are quite strictly enforced. You can only cross a road where there is a traffic light. And it works perfectly well. Nobody has a problem with it. But I'm amazed at the number of people, Nick, who have already this morning said to me, what next? You're going to have people being tracked wherever they go. Why do you want to enforce something which is unenforceable? It's extraordinary how many people who do cycle just don't want this.
Well, there are an awful lot of cyclists who actually do want it. I think it's the minority who are particularly vociferous.
Yes.
And their voice carries far more than the silent majority, as is often the way. So, many cyclists want to cycle but are frightened because of the dangers, and they would welcome these moves. And I've had significant support from other cyclists who say, look, what's being suggested here, and this has been suggested for a long time.
Yes.
So they said this is going to increase the safety of us on our roads, and who can ever criticise that? I of course accept that motoring doesn't have the same benefits that the green agenda has. When you cycle, it's healthy, it's fresh air, all the obvious stuff. But at the same time, it's dangerous. And why would anyone say I should be excluded from legislation? We've had a couple of cases recently where people have been killed by dangerous cycling, and there's actually no law in place, and the cyclists say, well, look, it's so rare, why should we have a law in place? Well, for those deceased, it's vital that they receive a sentence that reflects the gravity of their offence, and it also operates as a deterrent to cyclists who might feel inclined to cycle dangerously and throw caution to the wind in terms of the consequences. So instead of relying on 1861 legislation, we need to bring it bang up to date. Motorists are now facing a life sentence if you kill someone when you drive dangerously. Why shouldn't cyclists?
Yeah.
It isn't the whole act I'm going to cycle dangerously. I don't care about the consequences. God forbid you're involved in a fatal accident while you're doing that. You face the possibility of going to prison for the rest of your life. What is wrong with that?
Yes.
And, offences of causing serious injury while driving, cycling dangerously, due care, minor due care, serious injuries. These are offences that need to be considered. And I'm sure Grant Schapps will give due consideration to this.
And also,
the starting point.
Yeah, and the other thing, Nick, is that for those people who say, "Oh, how are you going to do it? How on earth are you going to make a registration plate available for a bike?" We are now living in a digital age. It's entirely possible to put a QR code on something. You could put it on the person rather than the actual vehicle. There's any number of ways of doing that, and the effect of making sure that people know that they can be tracked is that they presumably will behave better.
Of course. Just imagine taking number plates off cars. It will be mayhem.
Yeah.
Not with everyone, but some people, because they're not being. We're suddenly saying we can't actually trace you. Yeah. We can't track you. So we're relying on your integrity, and that's the situation that exists with cycles. So a registered tabard. For me, it's important that there is a visible sign that can be easily read by members of the public. So if you, for example, are a motorist and you have a dash cam. And you see a cyclist cycling dangerously, you can record it, and it's not just the cyclist cycling dangerously. You're going to have someone who's going to receive a notice, and if he doesn't respond to that notice, he's going to get 6 points on his driving license or his cycle license, and he's going to face a heavy fine. And of course, he's going to need insurance, etc., etc. So what we're saying is, all of us who use the roads are now going to be accountable. We're going to be held to account. And there's nothing unreasonable with that. No one can seriously argue against it.
No. And of course, yesterday, the other thing that you and I both spoke about in the past was e-scooters, which are also in dire need of regulation, because a study has come from Oslo University in which it says that these are the very vehicles which are now actually even more dangerous than cyclists and cycling, because the people who use them are likely to be young men, quite often using them after dark without a helmet and possibly intoxicated.
Yes, of course. Well, they actually fall into the category of motorcycles and mopeds.
Yeah.
So actually, they are legislated for, but the legislation is completely useless. So there is proper legislation in place, but what's the point of it if you don't know who's on them?
Right.
So they've missed out the foundation, and the foundation is identification.
Exactly right. And so what's the likelihood that this will actually happen? Because we do see an awful lot of this government's intentions on the front pages of the papers, but then 6 months later you go, whatever happened to that?
Yeah, well, I think, I don't know what's going to happen to Grant Schapps in September. If he's in office, he's clearly going to go ahead with it, and he's urged his successor to do so. And I think this is something that's going to be picked up by the public and by the media, because everyone seems to think it's a sensible idea, other than the small minority of cyclists. And it's going to gather weight, gather momentum, and it will happen. I have said for a long, long time that this is going to happen. The sooner it happens, the safer our roads will be for everyone. And that just makes common sense, doesn't it? That's just a sensible thing to happen for everybody.
Yes. Well, this is the thing. This is why I can't understand why anyone would be against it, because it clearly makes a fair playing field for everybody, and it protects everybody. Because even if you are a cyclist, and even if you do think that you ought to have some kind of liberty that nobody else is afforded, surely if you've got children, you want them to be protected by cyclists ramming down the street the wrong way or going through red lights, putting themselves and other people in terrible danger.
Yes, I think, cycling used to be conducted by a minority when the roads were much quieter. It was a very different world. Particularly since COVID, we've seen a massive increase in the number of cycles. Our roads are in a terrible state, and in the cities, London, and other cities, that road space is being eaten up by cyclists. They're taking the lanes away. That they're not used that often. So there's a friction, there's a resentment there. And there's a sense of entitlement that cyclists seems to have, that yes, they can use it, they don't have to contribute, and they don't have to be responsible. And that's not a healthy attitude. They need to adopt a different mindset and say, listen, we're all in this together. It's for everyone's good.
And you'll be delighted to know, as I am, that Paul in Wakefield concurs. He says, Mike, as a cyclist myself, I think regulation is long overdue. I daily see examples of bad and dangerous cycling, which gives us all a bad name. I don't believe it's everyone's right to ride a bicycle. I think people should take a test. If we're sharing the road with other vehicles, we should all have to live by the same rules. Couldn't have put it better myself.
There we go. Amen.
Yes, thank you very much indeed. Well, listen, it's good to know that we finally got somewhere, Nick, with our attempts to try and make the roads fairer for everybody. Nick Freeman there, author, commentator, criminal defence lawyer, of course, as well. He's spoken to many ministers in the past. Surely it makes perfect sense, does it not, for cyclists to have to adhere to the same rules and regulations as everybody else? We changed the highway code recently to give cyclists even more rights. There are parts of the country now where you can't turn left because there's a cycle lane, and you have to instead go straight on, turn right again, and then come back around and come at the street you wanted to turn left on from the opposite side. There is an absolute war going on in some of our cities against the motorist, and it's got to stop. You know, the revenue which this government makes and every other government makes from cars, from petrol, from fuel duty, from VAT, from the amount of money that people pay in tolls to go over certain roads. It's absolutely ridiculous. Road tax as well. Imagine where the government would be without all of that money if they didn't collect it. Imagine what would happen to the Treasury. They'd be about £50 billion worse off, maybe £100 billion worse off. Now it's time for the cyclists to take some responsibility and to be treated the exact same way as everybody else on the road. It makes perfect sense to me. I can't understand why anyone wouldn't want it. I want to hear from you.